The sun was beginning to lower behind the rocky ridges, painting the canyon in soft gold and long shadows. The light that once felt warm now began to fade into a cooler shade. The wind changed too, turning from soft and dry to sharper and colder. Lena leaned against the rock for support. Her ankle ached badly, and the skin around it was red from where the trap had held her. But she was free now. She could move. That alone filled her chest with a quiet kind of strength she hadn't felt all day. The hunter stood nearby, his eyes scanning the canyon. His movements were slow, controlled, and quiet. He had said very little since opening the trap, but he didn't have to. His presence spoke louder than words. Lena watched him adjust the strap of his rifle over his shoulder. His gaze kept returning to the direction where the stranger had disappeared. He wasn't relaxed. He was listening. Lena bent down slowly to touch her ankle. The skin was swollen, and it hurt when she tried to put pressure on it. She clenched her jaw but didn't make a sound. The hunter stepped closer. "You can walk?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. She nodded even though she wasn't sure. "I'll try." He watched her for a moment and then said, "We should leave this place before it gets dark." The wind moved softly through the tall grass, but the quiet was different now. It didn't feel peaceful. It felt watchful. Lena's grandmother had always told her that the canyon held two kinds of silence. One was friendly. The other was not. This one was not. She took a small step, wincing at the pain. The hunter extended his hand, not in a rushed or forced way, but steady, as if giving her the choice. Lena hesitated for just a second before taking it. His hand was rough, warm, and solid. With his help, she pushed herself upright. Her legs shook a little under the weight, but she stayed standing. The hunter led her along the edge of the trail, away from the open clearing where the trap had been. The shadows of the canyon stretched longer with each passing minute. The air grew colder. Every sound echoed louder now. The rustle of leaves, the soft crunch of their steps, the distant call of a hawk flying somewhere high above. The world around them was wide and quiet, but Lena could not shake the feeling that someone might still be near. She looked down once at the place where the trap had held her. The metal glinted faintly in the fading light. It looked lifeless now, but she would not forget the sound it made when it snapped shut. She didn't say anything, but her eyes held the memory like a mark on the earth. As they walked slowly, she noticed how the hunter always moved slightly ahead of her, not far, but enough to keep watch. His head turned from side to side, reading the land like someone who belonged to it. He didn't rush her, even though her steps were slow and uneven. He seemed to understand the kind of fear that made every sound feel bigger than it was. The trail curved along a narrow ridge that led toward a cluster of taller rocks. The wind whistled through the gaps, carrying the scent of the night. Lena's shawl fluttered behind her. She pulled it tighter around her shoulders. The temperature was dropping fast. The hunter glanced at her ankle and then at the path ahead. "Can you keep going?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she answered, though her voice was soft. She didn't want to sound weak. The sky above was turning orange and pink as the last light slipped away. In the distance, the land stretched wide and quiet. It would take time to reach her village, but she knew the way. She had walked this trail since she was young. Only this time she wasn't walking alone. As they moved through the narrow path, the canyon behind them grew darker. Every now and then, Lena turned her head to look back. The place where she had been trapped was now swallowed by shadow. It looked different now, cold and distant, like a part of a story that didn't belong to daylight anymore. The hunter didn't speak much, but Lena didn't mind. His quietness felt different from the silence of the canyon. It didn't feel threatening. It felt steady. She wanted to ask him about the stranger, about the trap, about why he was there in the first place. But the words stayed inside her. She didn't even know his name. They reached the cover of the taller rocks just as the sun dipped below the ridge. The light turned deep orange for a moment, then faded to gray. The hunter stopped and listened. Lena followed his gaze. There was no sound of footsteps behind them, only the wind and the faint echo of distant night birds. Still, he stayed alert. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small canteen, handing it to her without a word. She accepted it carefully and took a slow sip. The water was warm from the sun, but it felt like a blessing. She handed it back. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded once. "You're lucky I came through this way," he said after a long pause. She gave a small smile, though her ankle ached badly. "Yes," she whispered. "I know." The hunter didn't look proud or heroic. He just looked at the land, as if that was the only thing that ever mattered to him. He was a man used to quiet paths, not loud stories. Lena could tell. People like him didn't live in villages. They lived between trails, between the wind and the rocks. Night began to settle fully. The sky turned a deep blue, and the stars slowly appeared one by one. A single bright star hung low over the horizon. Lena had seen it many nights when she sat outside with her grandmother. It always reminded her that no matter how dark the night grew, the stars stayed. That thought gave her comfort now. The hunter moved to the front again. "We'll follow the ridge," he said. "It's safer up high," Lena nodded. She limped slightly as they walked, but she didn't stop. The land below was already deep in shadow, and the dark places in the canyon could hide anything, or anyone. The sound of their steps on the rocky path felt sharper than before. The wind brushed against her face, cool and thin. They walked for a long while without speaking. The night creatures had started to wake, the soft cry of an owl somewhere, the rustle of a rabbit in the brush. All of it was familiar, yet she couldn't shake the memory of that trap. It was a sound that would stay with her, a warning carved deep into her mind. At one point she stumbled slightly, and the hunter reached out to steady her arm. His grip was firm but careful. She whispered a quiet thank you, and he just nodded again. They moved on together, two quiet figures in the growing night. Eventually the lights from her village came into view, a faint glow flickering between the trees at the far end of the ridge. It was still a distance away, but seeing it filled her chest with relief. The night no longer felt endless. She felt tears press against her eyes, though none of them fell. She had not been sure she would make it back when she sat caught in that trap. The hunter stopped and looked toward the glow of the village. "You're close now," he said. "You're not coming with me?" she asked. He shook his head. "I don't stay in one place long." For a moment she didn't know what to say. This man had come out of nowhere, opened the iron that held her, and stood between her and danger. She wanted to thank him in a way that felt bigger than just words. But the wind carried her voice softly, and all she could manage was, "You helped me. I won't forget that." His eyes met hers briefly. They were calm, steady, like someone who had heard such words before and didn't need them to understand their meaning. "Be careful next time," he said. His voice was low but firm. "Not everyone walks with good hands." Lena nodded slowly. She watched as he turned toward the darker side of the ridge, away from the village. He walked the way he had arrived, quietly, with measured steps that left no trace. Within seconds, his figure blended into the night. The wind carried nothing but silence after him. She stood there for a moment, watching the path he disappeared down. The night air felt cooler against her skin, but it no longer felt as heavy. She pressed a hand gently against her ankle, feeling the dull ache. It would heal in time. But the memory of the sound, the snap of the trap, the footsteps in the wild, the silent figure of the hunter, would stay with her longer than the pain. Lena turned toward the village lights. She walked slowly, her steps uneven but steady. The stars above seemed brighter now, stretching across the sky like an endless blanket. Each one felt like a witness to what had happened in the canyon. The night carried the whisper of the wind, the memory of a stranger's footsteps, and the quiet promise of another day. When she finally reached the edge of the village, her grandmother's small house stood waiting. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the faint glow of the fire could be seen through the small window. For the first time since the morning, Lena let herself breathe fully. She walked inside with tired steps, but with the quiet strength of someone who had faced something wild and walked away from it. Far away, somewhere deep in the canyon, the wind moved through the rocks again, carrying the faint echo of a hunter's steps. Lena would never know his name, but she would never forget the day their paths crossed. Morning sunlight touched the valley softly, slipping through the cracks of the wooden walls. It warmed the quiet room where Nayeli lay. She opened her eyes slowly, unsure if she was awake or still caught between a dream and the memory of the cold desert. A soft beam of light rested on her face, making the dust in the air shine like tiny golden stars. The roof above her was made of thick wood. A warm blanket covered her body. The sharp pain in her shoulder was still there, but it no longer burned like fire. She turned her head and saw the same man from the night before. He sat near the foot of the bed on an old wooden chair. His hat was set on the table beside him. A small oil lantern burned low, though the morning light had already filled the room. His hands were rough from farm work and there was dust on his boots, but his face was calm. His eyes were steady like someone who was used to long, quiet days. Naomi tensed for a moment. She had grown up believing that people like him were not to be trusted. Yet he had not tied her up, had not thrown her out, had not turned his back with fear. Instead, he sat there like a man watching over a friend. When she moved, he noticed and straightened up a little. "You're awake," he said softly. His voice was warm, slow, careful. She didn't understand every word, but she caught enough to know he wasn't angry. He spoke like someone trying not to scare a frightened animal. She tried to sit up, but the pain in her shoulder made her wince. Her breath caught. He quickly lifted his hand, not to touch her, but to show her to stay still. Then he got up, walked over to a small table and poured water from a clay jug into a tin cup. He walked back slowly, placed the cup near her, and stepped back. She stared at the cup like it was something dangerous. He pointed to it and nodded once. His movements were simple and clear. She understood. Thirst burned in her throat. She reached out carefully, her fingers shaking. The cool water slid down her dry throat like a gift from the river. She closed her eyes for a moment as the world around her felt less heavy. The man waited. He didn't rush her. When she finished, he picked up a cloth from a bowl near the bed. He knelt down beside her and began cleaning the wound on her shoulder with gentle hands. She flinched at the sting but did not pull away. He worked with slow care like someone who had done this before. The cloth smelled faintly of herbs. It reminded her of home, of the old healer in her tribe who used wild plants to ease pain. He wrapped fresh bandages around her arm, tying them neatly. When he finished, he didn't speak many words. He only looked at her with quiet eyes and said, "Safe now." She understood enough. The room was simple, but everything inside it spoke of a steady life. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a shelf filled with jars and tools. The scent of hay and warm bread drifted in from the outside. She could hear the distant sound of animals, a horse's soft snort, the cluck of chickens, the creak of a windmill turning slowly in the breeze. Naomi's heart was still guarded. She watched his every move. She needed to know where she was. She needed to know if this man would turn her in or keep her alive for some hidden reason. But he moved like someone who had no hidden plan, just a farmer starting another day. After a while, he stepped outside. She heard the screen door creak shut behind him. For the first time since the attack near the river, she was alone in a safe space. She sat up slowly, testing her arm. The wound ached, but the bleeding had stopped. She looked around the room carefully. There was no sign of weapons pointed at her. No ropes. Just a simple farm home. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed. Her bare feet touched the wooden floor, still cool from the night. She stood up unsteadily. Her vision blurred for a moment and she gripped the table for support. She made her way to the small window, her steps quiet. She looked out. The land stretched out like a golden sea. Fields of wheat swayed gently under the breeze. A red barn stood not far from the house. A single horse grazed near the fence, its tail flicking lazily. Chickens scattered in the yard, pecking at the dirt. The farmer, Jack, though she didn't yet know his name, was out there, carrying a heavy sack of feed on his shoulder. His movements were slow and strong. She watched him for a while. She didn't know why she didn't just run. She could have slipped out the door and disappeared into the hills. But her body was weak, and deep down something told her this place was not like the others. This man had saved her when he could have walked away. As she leaned against the window frame, a gust of wind carried the scent of fresh bread. Her stomach growled loudly. She hadn't eaten in days. A moment later, the door creaked again. Jack stepped in, carrying a small wooden tray. On it was a loaf of warm bread, a bowl of soup, and a small piece of cheese. He set the tray on the table near her bed and stepped back again, leaving space between them. He didn't force the food on her. He just nodded once, the same way he did with the water. She stared at the bread like it was a trap. Her heart beat fast, but her hunger was stronger. She moved slowly to the chair and sat down. The smell of the bread filled her nose. She tore off a small piece, tasting it carefully. Warm, soft, real. She ate more, faster this time. The soup was light and warm, and she felt her strength return little by little. Jack watched quietly, his arms crossed loosely over his chest. He didn't interrupt. After a while, he spoke again. She couldn't understand all his words, but she caught the tone. He said something like safe, rest, and no trouble. His voice carried a steady rhythm. like the slow flow of water over stones. She didn't trust easily, but something about the way he spoke made her heartbeat slow down just a little. As the day stretched on, Nayeli stayed mostly inside the room. She was not ready to step into the open. She watched through the window as Jack worked. He fed the animals, repaired a fence, and drew water from the well. He never came too close to her, but he never ignored her either. Every few hours he checked the bandage and brought water or food. When the sun began to lower in the sky, turning the fields gold, she stepped outside for the first time. The cool air touched her skin. The barn smelled of hay and earth. Jack was standing by the fence fixing a loose plank. He turned when he heard her steps but didn't approach. He just nodded, then returned to his work. She stood there silent, watching him for a long time. The setting sun painted everything in warm orange light. A soft breeze moved her dark hair around her face. She still didn't understand why he had helped her, but she could feel something she hadn't felt in days, a small spark of safety. As the sky darkened, Jack lit the lantern inside the house. Nayeli returned to the room and lay on the bed, though not as a frightened stranger anymore. Her body was tired but less afraid. Outside, the night sounds of the farm began. Crickets, the windmill turning, the horse shifting in its stall. She stared at the wooden ceiling, her thoughts wandering. She didn't know this man's story. She didn't know what the world would look like tomorrow. But she knew one thing with quiet clarity. Last night she had thought she would die. This morning she had woken to light, food, and a man who had not turned her away. She pulled the blanket close, letting the warmth of the room sink into her bones. Her people were still out there somewhere, and danger had not disappeared. But for now, this small farm felt like a hidden corner of the world where the wind carried no threat. And as she closed her eyes that night, she didn't see darkness. She saw the image of a man fixing a fence in the golden light. Something in her heart whispered that her story had just begun. The wind moved softly over the golden fields as the days slowly passed, and the world around the farm began to feel different to Nayeli. When she had first opened her eyes in the small wooden room, her heart had been filled with fear and doubt. Now, as she sat near the window wrapped in a clean blanket, the sharp edge of that fear had grown quieter. She still did not trust easily, but the man who had found her, Jack, had done nothing to hurt her. Instead, each day he gave her a reason to breathe a little easier. One bright afternoon, the sky was painted a soft blue with long white clouds drifting lazily. The wheat fields danced gently with the wind. Jack was outside working as usual. Nayeli had begun to watch him closely, not because she feared him, but because there was something steady about the way he lived. Every morning he rose with the first light. He fed the animals. He repaired what was broken. He worked without noise or pride, as if his hands had known this land forever. Her shoulder was healing. The pain that once burned like fire had faded to a dull ache. She could lift her arm again, not fully, but enough to feel strong. That morning she had stepped outside without trembling. She had even helped him bring a small basket of eggs to the kitchen. She didn't speak much, and neither did he. But sometimes silence is enough between two people who don't yet share the same language. That afternoon, a storm began to form at the edge of the horizon. Dark clouds rose slowly, building like mountains in the distance. The wind grew stronger. The air smelled of rain and thunder. Jack moved quickly, tying the horses, covering the barrels, and closing the barn doors. Nayeli watched from the porch at first, unsure if she should go inside or help. She saw him lift a heavy sack of grain and carry it through the wind. His hat nearly flew off, but he held it with one hand and kept moving. Something inside her shifted in that moment. She had spent years believing men like him were nothing but enemies. Yet here he was, standing in the wind, working hard to keep his small farm safe. He wasn't fighting anyone. He was just protecting what was his. Without even thinking, she ran to the barn door, grabbed the loose rope, and tied it tight against the post. Jack turned quickly when he saw her. For a moment, she thought he might yell at her, but instead he nodded once. A simple, quiet sign of respect. The storm broke a few minutes later. Rain fell hard and fast, hitting the roof like drumming fingers. Thunder rolled across the sky. The horses stomped nervously in their stalls, and the wind whistled through the cracks in the wood. Nayeli and Jack worked side by side without a word. She held the lantern while he moved the feet away from the leaking roof. When the rain grew too strong, they closed the last door and stood together, breathing hard, water dripping down their clothes. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain pounding on the barn roof. Jack leaned against a wooden post, brushing wet hair from his face. Naomi's heart beat fast, not out of fear, but because this was the first time they had stood so close without walls between them. She could hear his breathing, steady and calm. His eyes met hers briefly. It wasn't the kind of look that frightened her. It was quiet and human. The kind of look that said, "I see you, I trust you." When the rain softened, he pointed toward the house. She nodded, and they walked back together through the wet grass. Inside, Jack lit the lantern and placed it on the table. The golden light filled the room, warm and soft, pushing away the grayness of the storm. She sat by the fire while he poured 2 cups of warm tea. She didn't understand every word when he spoke, but she caught enough to know he was talking about the storm, about the work outside. His hands moved as he spoke, making the words clearer. She listened. She didn't answer with full sentences, but sometimes a nod, a small word or a look was enough. She said her name slowly, Nayeli. He repeated it once, careful with the sound. She had never heard her name spoken by a settler before. It sounded strange, but not wrong. Then he tapped his chest and said, "Jack." Their names hung in the air between them like a small bridge. Not a strong one, not yet, but something real. She repeated his name once, quiet and soft. Days turned into a gentle rhythm after that. Each morning she helped a little more. She gathered eggs, carried water from the well, and cleaned the porch. At first, Jack would only nod and keep working. But slowly he began to speak to her more often in simple words. She didn't always understand, but she began to learn. She learned how he called the horse Lucky, how he named the barn cat Whisk, and how he always whistled softly at sunrise. She had grown up living close to the land, so she understood the way things moved, the animals, the sky, the signs of weather. Once she noticed the fence was loose near the horse pen before he did. She showed him by pressing the post with her hand. He looked surprised, then pleased. Together they fixed it. No one spoke. The silence was enough. On one warm evening when the sun melted into the horizon, turning the fields orange and gold, Jack brought out a small harmonica. He sat on the porch steps and began to play a slow, gentle tune. Naomi stood near the doorway listening. She had never heard this kind of music before. It was soft and low, almost like the wind over the river at night. It wrapped around the air like a story without words. As the music played, something inside her chest loosened. For weeks she had carried the weight of fear and loss. She had run alone through darkness, believing the world held no kindness left for her. But here on this quiet farm, a simple tune made the world feel less hard. She sat down near him on the porch, not too close, but near enough to feel the warmth of the lantern light on her skin. Jack didn't stop playing. He didn't look at her like a stranger. He just kept playing until the last note faded into the night. Fireflies danced near the fence line. The stars began to appear above them one by one. That night she slept deeply. Not because her body was tired, but because for the first time in many moons her heart didn't feel like it was hiding behind a wall. The next morning, she woke before sunrise. Jack was already outside feeding the animals. She joined him without asking. He handed her a small bucket of grain. She spread it out carefully for the chickens. He watched her for a moment, then gave a small smile, the kind that was barely there but real. She had not planned to trust anyone. Trust had been taken from her long ago, burned away by fear and pain. But trust has a quiet way of growing, like a seed pushing through dry earth after a rain. She felt it now, though she didn't say it. When she returned to the house later, she saw her reflection in the small piece of mirror hanging on the wall. Her face was thinner, her hair tangled, her skin marked by the hard weeks behind her. But her eyes were different. There was life in them again. The days after the storm grew brighter. She began to speak more words, repeating the ones Jack used often. Sometimes he laughed softly at how she pronounced them. Not mocking, but patient, like a teacher who didn't mind repeating lessons 1,000 times. And sometimes when she spoke her own language, he tried to mimic her sounds, stumbling but trying. Those small moments made her chest feel warm in a way she didn't fully understand. Evenings became their quiet time. He would light the lantern. She would sit near the fire, and together they would listen to the wind outside. She told him her name again one night, slower this time, explaining the meaning with her hands. He listened closely, nodding. She didn't know if he understood, but he cared enough to listen. And sometimes that was more than enough. Nayeli still didn't know where her path would lead. She didn't know if the men who had chased her would return. She didn't know if she would ever find her people again, but as the sun set behind the golden fields each day, she found herself standing next to Jack, not as a prisoner, not as an enemy, but as someone learning how to live again. She had once closed her eyes to die. Now she opened them each morning to a farm where the wind carried the smell of bread, the sound of animals waking, and the quiet rhythm of a man who had chosen kindness over fear. And little by little she began to feel like she belonged somewhere again. The sky over the valley carried a pale shade of gold that morning. A gentle wind moved across the wheat fields, and the quiet sound of horses drifted softly from the barn. Everything felt peaceful, but inside Jack's small farmhouse, Nayeli woke with an uneasy feeling deep in her chest. She didn't know why. It was the kind of feeling that came before something changed. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened carefully. The windmill turned slowly outside. The air was too still for her comfort. She stepped to the small window, pushing the curtain aside just a little. The fields looked the same, but in the distance she saw a line of dust rising near the road. Dust like that didn't rise by accident. It rose when horses were coming fast. Her heart tightened. She had lived long enough to know what that meant. Riders. And they were coming straight toward the farm. Jack was already outside, working near the barn. He saw the dust too and turned his head sharply. He straightened his back and looked out across the land with quiet focus. He didn't panic. He simply wiped his hands on his trousers, untied the horse from the post and moved it behind the barn where it wouldn't be seen right away. Then he walked toward the house with long, quick steps. Nayeli met him at the doorway. She didn't need to say anything. Her face spoke enough. He gave one firm nod, his jaw set in a hard line. He didn't ask her to hide, but she understood. She moved silently to the small space beside the staircase where she could watch through the gap without being seen. The riders arrived minutes later. 5 men on horses, their coats dusty, their voices sharp. She recognized their kind immediately. Not soldiers, settlers. The kind who carried rifles not just for hunting. They didn't trust her people. Most of them never had. They pulled their horses to a stop in front of the house. One of them, a man with a wide hat and a scar on his chin, spoke loudly. "Jack," he called. "We heard something. Someone saw tracks near the river. Apache tracks." Jack stepped out onto the porch, calm but firm. "Morning," he said in his slow, steady voice. The man on the horse narrowed his eyes. "Don't play dumb. They say an Apache woman was seen near here. You know what happens when one of them shows up. Could be trouble. Could be a scout for more." Nayeli held her breath in the shadow of the wall. She could hear every word. She could also see the rifles resting across their saddles. One move could end everything. Jack didn't flinch. "I've been working the farm," he said simply. "Ain't seen anything." Another rider, younger and impatient, leaned forward on his horse. "We should check the house," he said. "Can't trust anybody these days. She could be hiding right under your roof." Jack's hand rested against the post on the porch. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood firm. "This is my land," he said. "My house. No one goes in unless I say so." The men shifted on their horses. A quiet tension hung in the air like a rope pulled tight. Nayeli pressed her fingers against her knee to keep them from shaking. She had seen moments like this before, and they never ended kindly. But this time something felt different. The man with the scar tilted his head. "Jack," he said slowly, "you're a good neighbor. Don't make this hard. We're just being careful." "I'm careful too," Jack answered. "That's why nobody walks through my door without my say-so." For a long moment no one spoke. The sound of the windmill creaking and the horses snorting filled the silence. Then, to everyone's surprise, the scarred man gave a short nod. "Fine, but if we find something later, we'll come back. And we won't ask so nicely." The horses turned slowly. Dust rose behind them as they rode back down the dirt road. Nayeli didn't move until the sound of hooves faded far away. Jack stood on the porch a moment longer, watching the road. Then he turned and walked back inside. His boots thudded softly on the wooden floor. Nayeli stepped out of the shadow. Her hands were shaking, but she forced them to be still. He looked at her not with anger, but with quiet understanding. "They'll be back," she said softly in her own language. She didn't know if he understood the words, but he caught the meaning in her eyes. He nodded slowly. "I know," he said. She sat down on the chair near the wall. The room suddenly felt smaller. The quiet safety she had begun to feel now seemed fragile. like a thin thread that could snap at any time. But even as fear pressed at her chest, she remembered the way Jack had stood outside, calm, unshaken, ready to protect his home. Later that day, she walked outside into the golden light. The sun had climbed high, but the peace was different now. It carried the shadow of danger. She walked slowly to the edge of the wheat field. She could still see the faint trail where the riders had come. She didn't know why Jack had lied for her. She had nothing to give him in return, yet he had chosen to stand in front of men armed with rifles and turn them away. When she came back, Jack was fixing the fence again. He didn't talk about what had happened. He didn't need to. She picked up a small wooden post and held it steady while he hammered it into the ground. Neither spoke, but the sound of wood against metal filled the silence. It was their way of saying what words couldn't. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and soft pink, Nayeli sat on the porch steps. Jack sat near the door, sharpening an old tool. She wrapped her arms around her knees and watched the horizon. "I should go," she whispered, mostly to herself. She didn't want to bring more trouble to his home. If those men returned and found her, it wouldn't just be her life at risk, it would be his too. Jack lifted his head slowly, meeting her eyes. He shook his head once. "Not yet," he said quietly. She wanted to argue, but the way he said it was gentle and firm at the same time. Not an order, not a demand, just a choice he had already made. The night grew quiet. The stars appeared above them, clear and sharp. She remembered how she had once closed her eyes in the desert, waiting for the darkness to take her. She had thought she would never see another sunrise. But now she sat on a porch wrapped in a blanket, listening to the soft sound of crickets. The next morning she rose before the sun. She walked down to the river, careful to keep to the shadows. She knelt by the water and let her hand touch the cold surface. In the reflection, she saw the face of someone who was no longer the same warrior who had fallen near the rocks. Something inside her had changed since Jack found her. When she returned, Jack was already up, feeding the animals. He greeted her with a quiet nod as always. The world around them felt calm again, but she knew what waited beyond the fields. The men could return at any moment. She had learned to live with danger, but now it wasn't just her life that felt at risk. She looked at Jack as he worked in the soft morning light. He wasn't her family. He wasn't her tribe. But he had given her something she had almost forgotten existed. Safety, a place to breathe, a small piece of peace in a wild land. The days that followed were slow and steady, but the shadow of that visit never disappeared completely. At night, she sometimes woke to the sound of the wind outside, half expecting horses to return. But Jack's quiet presence reminded her she wasn't alone anymore. And though the world outside their small farm still carried danger, something stronger had begun to take root between them. Not spoken out loud, not written in any way, but real. Trust built in quiet moments, in shared work, in the simple courage of standing at the porch when others came with suspicion. She didn't know what the future would bring. But she knew that day had changed something. It had tied their fates together in a way neither of them had planned. And as the last light of evening fell over the valley, she understood one truth clearly. She was no longer just surviving. She was living, and she was not doing it alone. The spring morning came soft and warm, painting the valley in gold. A quiet mist rested over the fields, and the sky was bright with a soft blue light. Birds moved through the air, calling to one another, and the steady sound of the windmill turning broke the silence. Nayeli stepped outside with bare feet on the wooden porch, breathing in the fresh air. The world felt alive again. The pain in her shoulder had faded, leaving only a thin scar as a reminder of the night she thought would be her last. She stood there for a long moment, feeling the sun touch her face. When she had first opened her eyes on this farm, she had been a broken warrior, a girl with nothing left to fight for. But time had moved slowly and kindly here. Each day had stitched something back together inside her. She was not the same woman who had crawled between the rocks to die. Behind her, Jack stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on his trousers. He carried the easy calm of a man who worked the land his whole life. He nodded at her like he did every morning. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it always felt steady and warm. She gave a small nod in return. Their quiet language had grown over weeks, built not from many words but from shared moments. Nayeli walked down toward the field, brushing her fingers against the tops of the wheat. She could still see faintly the trail where the riders had come. But they hadn't returned since that day. Maybe they thought they had scared Jack enough. Maybe they simply forgot. Whatever the reason, the silence of the valley had remained. She spent the morning helping Jack with small chores. She still moved carefully because of the scar, but she was stronger now. She fetched water from the well, scattered feed for the chickens, and helped patch a small hole in the barn roof with pieces of wood. Jack never treated her like a burden. He worked beside her like she was part of the place. She didn't know how to explain it in words, but it made something inside her feel steady. After they finished, they sat on the porch steps with mugs of warm tea in their hands. The breeze carried the scent of grass and hay. Jack leaned back against the wooden post, letting the sun touch his face. Naili watched the horizon where the sky and land met. She had grown up watching the world from a different place, but somehow this view had become familiar. She could see why someone like Jack would choose to live far away from everything. But deep inside her, something began to stir. She had a people, a home, a tribe scattered but not gone. She didn't know where they were now, but she felt their memory like a quiet drumbeat in her heart. She couldn't stay hidden on this farm forever. As much as she had grown used to the soft rhythm of this place, she knew one day she would have to walk beyond the wheat fields. Jack seemed to sense it too. He wasn't a man of many words, but sometimes he could read things in silence. That afternoon, as they stacked wood near the porch, he looked at her in a way that said he knew she carried something heavy inside. "You'll go," he said quietly. The words settled between them like falling leaves. She looked down at her hands. She didn't know how to answer, but she didn't have to. He already knew. She had stayed long enough to heal, to rest, to remember what it felt like to live again. "I'll go," she whispered, her voice soft as wind over grass. They didn't speak after that, but something changed in the air around them. Not in a painful way, just honest. The truth between them didn't need to be dressed in grand speeches. That night they sat together near the fire. Jack took out his old harmonica, the one she had grown to love. He played the same slow tune he always played when the stars came out. The sound wrapped around the room like a soft blanket. Nayeli sat with her knees pulled close, listening. She knew she would carry this sound with her wherever she went. When the fire burned low, she stood and walked outside. The night sky was full of stars. She lifted her head and looked at the horizon. Somewhere out there, beyond the dark hills, her people were still alive. The world was wide and dangerous, but she was no longer afraid to face it. She was no longer the broken warrior who had closed her eyes to die. The next morning she rose before dawn. The air was cool and gentle. She packed what little she had, a small pouch of herbs, a piece of bread Jack had baked the night before, a strip of cloth, and the feather necklace she had carried since childhood. She tied it carefully around her neck. It was the only thing that had followed her from her old world into this one. Jack was already outside when she stepped onto the porch. He didn't ask questions. He didn't try to stop her. He only looked at her the same way he had the night he found her between the rocks, with calm eyes and quiet strength. He handed her a canteen of water and a small bundle of food. "You'll need this," he said simply. She took it and nodded, her throat tight. Words felt small in a moment like this. She wanted to thank him, but how do you thank someone who gave you back your life? Instead, she stepped forward and placed her hand gently over his. It was a small gesture, but it carried everything she couldn't say out loud. His hand was warm and steady. "Thank you," she whispered finally. He gave a single nod, the corners of his mouth lifting just enough to show a quiet smile. The sun rose slowly behind the hills as she walked toward the edge of the field. Each step felt both heavy and light. She carried the weight of leaving, but also the strength of everything she had found. She turned back once at the edge of the road. Jack stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, watching her. Not as someone trying to keep her, but as someone letting her go with respect. She raised her hand once in farewell. He raised his too, no words. Just a simple, silent promise that this moment would never be forgotten. Naili walked on as the world opened wide before her. The land stretched far, full of wild rivers, mountains, and wind. She didn't know what waited for her out there. But she knew this. She was no longer just surviving. She carried something inside her now. The warmth of a home she hadn't expected. The trust of a man who had no reason to help her but did. The memory of a quiet farm that had healed a broken warrior. She followed the road until the house behind her became a small shape against the horizon. The feather around her neck moved gently with the wind. For the first time in a long time, her steps didn't feel like they were leading her away from something. They felt like they were leading her toward something new. Jack stayed on the porch long after she disappeared into the hills. The wheat fields moved softly, the barn stood quiet, and the wind carried the faint echo of the past weeks. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He knew she would carry this place with her just as he would carry the memory of the strong, silent warrior who had once appeared on his land like a storm and left like a sunrise. In the months that followed, whenever the wind blew across the valley at night, Jack sometimes thought he could still hear the sound of her soft footsteps on the porch. He would look out into the darkness, not with sadness but with quiet pride. And somewhere far beyond the fields, Nayeli walked with a steady heart. She would always remember the farmer's kindness. It had turned a moment of death into the beginning of her second life. The valley, the porch, and the soft tune of the harmonica would live in her memory forever, not as a chapter of fear, but as the place where she learned to breathe again.